Hello and welcome. My name is Mohammed Saleh and welcome to this special program. Now, Europe is sweltering under an extreme heat wave, and yet there are countries that are telling their citizens to cut back on their energy consumption. Why? Because they are extremely worried that there simply will not be enough energy left for the winter. In today's episode of Full Context, we take a deep dive into what is causing Europe's energy crisis.
Fort de ce nouveau contexte, on doit absolument réinvestir dans tous nos stocks et nos capacités, continuer d'embaucher, de former et continuer d'avoir une armée encore plus forte, car ceux qui nous disaient il y a quelque temps la guerre de haute intensité ne reviendra plus, se sont, on le voit bien, trompés. La Russie utilise l'énergie, comme elle utilise d'ailleurs l'alimentation, comme une arme de guerre.
So Europe's worst nightmare is unfolding this week. On Monday, Russia's energy giant Gazprom began 10 days of maintenance work on the Nord Stream 1 pipeline. Remember, we're talking about the Nord Stream 1. And days later, Gazprom said that it could not guarantee as to when the pipeline would actually become functional again, since that depended on a turbine engine currently undergoing maintenance work in Canada. While Canada has agreed to deliver turbines that are needed to maintain the pipeline, despite sanctions that are in place against Russia, Germany and other European countries are now waiting very anxiously to see if the gas comes back again in the next 10 days, or whether there will be more delays. They fear that Gazprom might actually take this opportunity to simply shut off the valves. Meanwhile, Canada's decision to allow the parts to be shipped to Germany has also upset Ukraine. Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has defended the decision, saying that the sanctions are aimed at Vladimir Putin and are not designed to harm citizens of their allies. Berlin has not provided a timetable for the return of the turbines. In the weeks leading up to the scheduled maintenance, Russia had already reduced supplies by nearly about 60%. Blaming the absence of a turbine. These cuts also had a knock-on effect on the supplies to a number of EU states, while Poland and Bulgaria have seen theirs stopped altogether. Now, on your screens is the Nord Stream pipeline. The Nord Stream 1 was completed over a decade ago, back in 2011. It runs from Viborg in Leningrad to Lubmin in Germany. The Nord Stream 1 pipeline transports a staggering 55 billion cubic meters of gas every year. Now, to put that in perspective, Europe requires about 100 billion cubic meters of gas each year. So clearly, Nord Stream 1 individually makes up more than half of the gas supplies to Europe. This gas is used for heating homes, factories and offices, especially in the harsh, long European winters. It's also used for power generation across the continent. In Western Europe, Russia is its largest single supplier of gas, and on your screens are all the pipelines that link Europe and Russia. So if Moscow chooses to turn off the tap on the Nord Stream 1, then it means serious trouble for Europe. It could lead to absolute chaos across the continent. Energy costs would simply go through the roof, and millions of people across Europe will have to deal with unheard of power outages. The biggest question, of course, is can Europe find a replacement in the current situation? It is highly unlikely at this point of time, and it's also going to be extremely hard to substitute Russian gas quickly enough. Europe could look at importing more liquefied natural gas from the United States and also ramp up its other energy resources. But doing so will neither be quick, nor will it be easy, nor is that going to be economical. France, to that end, has urged its citizens to rein in their energy consumptions. President Macron said that the country must very quickly learn how to do without Russian gas. But the question, of course, is, can Europe do without Russian gas?
Ça veut dire des contraintes, des choix. Mais quand on est intelligent, on essaie que ces contraintes passent le moins possible. Qu'est-ce qu'on doit faire? On doit essayer de réduire, pour passer le pic de l'hiver, nos stocks, parce qu'on aura besoin d'être solidaires avec les autres Européens. Et on doit le faire pour qu'il n'y ait jamais de coupure complète et essayer le moins possible d'arrêter notre économie.
Energy prices that were already increasing even before Russia launched its war against Ukraine at the end of February have sharply risen since then, leading to the highest inflation in most major global economies in decades. And this is a situation that not many expected even about 6 months ago, but now are confronted with skyrocketing gas prices. Can Europe deal with this crisis? Now, to discuss this, we are joined in by Ms. Natalia Guzak, who is the Executive Director of Eco-Action in Ukraine. She's joining us live from Kiev. Now, Ms. Guzak, thank you very much indeed for taking time out and speaking to us. This is a crisis that was not unexpected, because ever since Russia invaded into Ukraine, it was quite clear that gas will be a major pressure point. Nord Stream 1 has now shut down for about 10 days for maintenance work. But do you think this is just general maintenance, or could there be a period that will be longer than 10 days that Russia would decide to cut off gas to Germany?
True. From the Ukrainian perspective, as Eco-Action, I'm working with is environmental NGO. So from our perspective, the overall situation with the energy was very obvious from 2014, when actually Russia invaded Ukraine and the war started. And it is clear that gas is used by Russia as a geopolitical instrument to influence decision makers in Europe and other countries. So definitely sanctions aiming to cut the consumption is not only the instrument to stop the war because of the less income to the Russians' military budgets, but definitely to make less dependence on the fossil fuels, on the energy source in Europe. The same situation actually with nuclear energy, which is used by Russia also historically as the geopolitical instrument. And unfortunately, it's not so much discussed, but still the instruments are very similar.
Absolutely. So, now, Ms. Guzak, this is, as you mentioned very correctly, that this is something that Europe should have foreseen right from 2014 onwards, ever since Russia invaded and occupied Crimea, because there was a conflict that was brewing, that's been brewing since the last 8 years. It's not happened in the last 5 months, it's happened in the last 8 years. So has Europe sleepwalked into this crisis where it potentially finds itself in a situation that it is addicted to Russian gas and there's nothing that it can do to immediately wean itself off Russian gas?
Actually, that was what we were talking about for years and years, that this addiction should be stopped, not now clearly because of the war and the overall energy situation, but also because of the climate change. Fossil fuels are fueling not only climate change, but this war. So this is really very... shows the rigid approach of the decision makers in EU, focusing more on the current state, which is fine for them, and the efforts which were in place to support renewables energy development were definitely not enough.
Absolutely, indeed, because this is something that Europe seems clearly not to have planned for. It's a crisis that it appears to have sleepwalked. Ms. Guzak, do continue to stay on with us, because we want to discuss more in terms of what the ramifications of this crisis will be, because Hungary this week has declared an emergency of energy. Officials have said that this is due to the supply disruptions and also because of the skyrocketing energy prices across Europe. Now, the country has released a 7-point plan to counter it. The government will also be stepping up its domestic natural gas production from about 1.5 to to 2 billion cubic meters while seeking other sources of gas. It also imposed an export ban on energy sources such as firewood and boost domestic production of lignite coal. It also reopened one power station at Mantra and extend the operation of the Pax nuclear power plant near Budapest. Now, Hungary is not rich in homegrown energy sources. It currently imports nearly about 65% of its oil and 80% of its gas from Russia. And after Moscow launched its war against Ukraine, the EU, of which Hungary is a member, has sought to target Russian oil exports with sanctions. Hungary, very much aware of its dependency on Russia, has sought and negotiated a concession which allows for a temporary exemption for oil imports delivered by the Russian Druzhba pipeline to the landlocked nation like Hungary. All right, now, this of course is a situation that Hungary perhaps would have wished that it was not pushed into. But Ms. Gazak, this is something that Hungary will have to confront with. It is a nation in Eastern Europe. Without Russian gas, it will have to rely on other sources of energy. It is looking at things like coal and even nuclear power. Do you think this is something that is feasible?
We all monitor and see situation in Hungary, which is really upsetting in all this process. But unfortunately, Hungary is not the only country so much dependent on Russian fossil fuels. Just the political influence in Hungary is higher than other countries. That's why we see so, let's say, bold position on this. We know definitely that other EU countries have also big dependence on Russian gas, like Germany or even Poland. But Poland managed to step out quickly enough, understanding clearly the situation, even if it means the higher prices.
Right.
Though for Hungary, my understanding is that the pressure from Russia on them is the highest now, so they just support, let's say, the pro-Russian policy here. Also, I should mention that actually India is the country which is #1 on raising imports of Russian crude oil for the last month. So I wish really this situation would be not so dramatic in general, but definitely India itself should pay attention and join the sanctions with other countries.
Absolutely, that's an important point that you've raised there, but the fact remains that Europe in one afternoon purchases more Russian hydrocarbons than what India does, in a span of a month. The question that I want to ask you lastly, Ms. Gazak, is right now countries across Europe are making noises that they would wean themselves off of Russian hydrocarbons, that they would, somehow go away from their dependence on Russian gas and oil. But do you think once the war subsides, which could happen, in some time from now, because that is something that will happen, if not now, or at least sometime in the near future, like in 6 months' time, do you think the European nations will really break and decouple themselves from their dependence on Russian hydrocarbons? Or once the tensions in Ukraine subside, will Europe again go back to being dependent on Russian hydrocarbons?
My understanding is that Russia showed to all the world the real price of their hydrocarbons, and I do believe that after Ukraine wins and Russia is in decline of economic decline, the neighboring countries and countries exporting fossil fuels will definitely step out, and even if once stepping out of buying Russian fossil fuels, it makes sense to diversify not towards other sources, but towards other principal sources of energy, like renewables, wind and solar energy would be definitely the most logical and the next step for energy systems development. So my vision is that definitely this dependence would end Maybe for some countries quicker, for others a bit longer, but definitely the future is without fossil fuels. That's
All
clear.
right. All right, the future is without fossil fuels, but how long will Europe stay dependent on Russian fossil fuels? This, of course, is the big question. Thank you very much indeed, Ms. Gosak, for joining us from Kiev and getting us all those insights there.
Yeah, bye.
Now, in the first 100 days of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Russia exported a staggering $97.7 billion worth of fossil fuels. That's an average of $977 million per day, despite the sanctions and the import bans. So let's take a look as to which fossil fuels are being exported by Russia and who is importing these Russian fossil fuels. Well, Russian crude oil is shipped on tankers. A network of pipelines transports Russian gas to Europe. Now, on your screens right now is Russia's energy exports from the 24th of February onwards, when Russia started its invasion. The Moscow's biggest export was crude oil. The country earned almost about $48.3 billion from it, followed by pipeline gas, from which it earned about $25 billion. It also exported oil products, liquefied natural gas and coal. The next obvious question is then, who brought them? The European Union accounted for about 61% of Russia's fossil fuel export revenue during the 100-day period. Germany, Italy and the Netherlands, members of both the EU and NATO, were amongst the largest importers, with only China surpassing them. China overtook Germany as the largest importer, importing nearly about 2 million barrels of discounted Russian oil per day in the month of May, up by 55% from the year ago. Russia also surpassed Saudi Arabia as China's largest oil supplier. India too has substantially increased its oil imports from Russia since the beginning of the war in Ukraine. Now, amidst this fuel crisis, Europe is recording soaring temperatures. From France to Spain to Italy, swathes of the continent is boiling. So let's start with what is happening in Spain, where data suggests that the continental heat wave is at its peak. Temperatures have already reached about 45.6 degrees Celsius in the country. Several regions have been put under a red alert. Along with unprecedented heat waves, firefighters and soldiers are also jointly fighting wildfires in the western part of the region, showing an alarming trend. Over 70,000 hectares of forests went up in smoke from the 1st of January till the 3rd of July. Now, this is almost double the average of the last 10 years. As precautionary measure, residents were given strict travel orders to not venture outside unless it was absolutely essential. Some residents are also experiencing suffocation due to the extreme heat wave, so the Health Ministry has advised everyone in the country to drink plenty of fluids, wear light clothing and also stay in air-conditioned rooms. Moving on to neighbouring Portugal, where wildfires have now claimed the life of one person. The country is battling at least about 20 wildfires, and the whole country has been put on high alert. Several villages in central Portugal are also facing increased risk of fires. So let's also take a look as to what is happening in France, where a wildfire ripped through southwestern region which burnt as much as about 2,500 acres of pine trees. At least about 150 people have been forced out of their homes, and another fire near Europe's tallest sand dune consumed thousands of acres of pine trees. And this year has also been exceptionally brutal. A continent that mostly remains cool is witnessing record-breaking heat. High temperatures are also expected to spread to Western and Central Europe in the coming days. The global warming, along with the pressures related to the Russia-Ukraine war, has of course seen Europe take some giant step backwards in fighting climate change. Last year, the continent had the most ambitious green agenda that was aimed at cutting down its carbon emissions by about 55% by the year 2030 from the levels of 1990. Now, under the Green Deal, the bloc had earmarked at least about $1 trillion over a period of 10 years for sustainable investments. The bloc also allocated a third of its budget for the next half-decade to green projects and asked its member nations to lay out at least about 37% of the more than $700 billion pandemic recovery package on spending that supports climate goals. But those ambitions relied on gas piped from Russia to keep economies humming along, while waiting for investments in renewables, electric cars and green technologies to cut emissions from heavy industries. Meanwhile, Russia's war in Ukraine has dealt a big blow to that project, sending Europe quickly to dirtier fuels. But what is interesting is that Germany is delaying its retirement of some coal and oil-fired power plants. The Dutch are also lifting a cap on power from coal, while Austria, interestingly, is reviving the shuttered coal power stations. France is also preparing a coal plant as a reserve for the winter months. Several countries are also investing in terminals to import LNG and pipelines to connect them to the existing networks. Infrastructure that will last decades, and that means that Europe will be burning more coal, effectively backpedaling on its decarbonization program, even as the current heat wave acts as a reminder of the dangers of delayed climate change. Now, another major question that actually pops up is whether Europe is prepared to deal with the rising temperatures. What remains to be seen is how well the Europeans will adapt to the harsh reality of a warming planet. Heat waves in Europe are causing forest fires, buckled train tracks and warnings over air quality and water shortages. In fact, Europe is heating up faster than most other places. Historically, the European continent has been pretty cold, with very cold winters and reasonably cool summers. As most European capitals developed at a time before air conditioning, planners had to design buildings to respond to the changing environmental conditions without mechanical assistance. The European countries have narrow streets, dense residential areas, and also buildings and houses built with small windows. Even the materials used for buildings have a larger thermal mass, which will have to absorb and store heat. While older buildings still had a system where you could rely on internal climate control like high ceilings and big windows, in modern construction, the greater use of glass in the construction of newer homes and apartments has left them extremely vulnerable to climate change. In the United Kingdom, many buildings are designed to maximize the amount of sunlight that streams in, especially during the longer winter months. In many older and smaller European cities, the older buildings often have poorer populations that are more vulnerable to heat stress. On the other hand, hot countries like India have traditionally used materials to keep houses cool. In Yemen's ancient walled city of Sana'a, mud skyscrapers soar high into the sky. With the planet getting hotter due to the human-caused climate change, Europe will of course need to invest in infrastructure that is prepared for a climate-resilient future. Presently, changing climatic conditions pose a risk to the existing transport infrastructure. Infrastructure is in fact built on the basis of a country's historical climate variation, and extreme high temperatures have an impact on road pavements through increased levels of rutting. While railway tracks have a tendency to buckle under extreme heat, buildings and homes in Europe have been designed to keep warm and not cool. In fact, the idea of air conditioning in Europe is a foreign concept, but it is fast catching on. With the planet getting hotter due to human-caused climate change, Europeans will of course have to rethink their opposition to the idea of air conditioning. Less than 5% of all European households at this point of time are said to be air conditioned, in comparison with 90% in the United States, that has made them amongst the lowest users of the cooling machines in the world. In fact, according to the International Energy Agency, of the 2.8 billion people living in the hottest parts of the world, only 8% currently possess air conditioning. In a survey, the European respondents said that they see climate change threatening their place of residence. 29% of the Europeans also believe that eventually they'll have to move to another country or region because of problems due to climate change. However, we have one planet, and all of us will have to deal with the threats of a world that is heating up and heating up pretty fast due to climate change. A green transition that is low carbon and also resilient is needed, but also making sure that no one is left behind. Well, that's all the time we have in our special show called Full Context. Thanks for watching.